Elizabeth Montgomery couldn't believe the words she had just heard through the half-open door of her father's study. Her heart stopped. The world around her began to spin in slow motion. Richard Montgomery's voice, usually so certain, so commanding, now sounded like the voice of a broken man. I had no choice. Dmitry Volkov doesn't accept no for an answer. Either she goes, or we all die. Montgomery Pharmaceutical will be burned to the ground, along with everything that bears our name. Elizabeth pressed her back against the cold wall of the hallway, feeling her legs begin to give way beneath her. 24 years. 24 years of a life lived in luxury, under the glittering lights of New York's elite, in a world where the biggest problem was choosing the right dress for a charity gala. And now, in a single November night, all of it was going to end. The second voice in the study was deep, carrying a heavy Russian accent that sounded like velvet wrapped around cold steel. Your daughter in exchange for your life, and the chance to rebuild what's left of your pathetic pharmaceutical empire. It's a far more generous offer than you deserve, Richard. The people who have crossed me before received a bullet in the back of the head and a grave in the New Jersey marshes. Elizabeth felt the bile rise in her throat. This couldn't be real. Her father, a respected businessman, a philanthropist, a man who sat on the boards of 3 hospitals and a university foundation, could not be selling her like merchandise to a Russian gangster. But deep in her heart, she already knew it was true. The last 6 months had been full of strange signs. Her father locking himself in his study every night, smoking one cigarette after another, strange, because he had quit 10 years ago. Her mother, who suddenly left for a health resort in Switzerland and wouldn't answer her calls. Security guards who began appearing at their Upper East Side residence. Phone calls that cut off in the middle of the night. Strange men in black suits waiting in cars parked outside their home. When, her father's trembling voice asked, "Tonight, my men will arrive at 11. Have her ready." And Richard, Dimitri's voice dropped even colder. "If you try to deceive me, if you try to run or hide her, I will find you. And then not only you will die, everyone you have ever loved, everyone who carries the Montgomery name, they will be erased from the face of the earth. Is that clear?" "Yes, it's clear." Elizabeth moved away from the door, feeling tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. She walked back to her room on the 3rd floor of the residence, passing the portraits of Montgomery ancestors that watched her from the walls with their severe, unforgiving gazes. She wondered if any of them had ever sold their own child to save their own skin. Her room was exactly as she had left it that morning. Once this place had been her sanctuary. The large canopy bed she had slept in since she was 14. The vanity covered in Chanel and Dior perfumes. The wardrobe filled with clothes from the finest designers. The view of Central Park through the panoramic windows. All of it now felt like it belonged to another life. A life that would end in less than 3 hours. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her reflection in the mirror across from her. Her long brown hair fell in soft waves around her face. The blue eyes she had inherited from her mother looked too large now, too terrified. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the glow of the bedside lamp. She looked exactly the same as any other day of her life, but she felt like a completely different person. Dmitry Volkov. She had heard that name whispered at parties, in conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. A Russian magnate, officially running an import-export empire worth billions of dollars. Unofficially, controlling most of organized crime in New York. A man who was feared. A man no one dared to say no to. And now she was going to belong to him. Elizabeth stood and began mechanically packing a suitcase, though she had no idea what you were supposed to bring into a life as a criminal's property. Underwear. Cosmetics. Books. Did any of it even matter? Her hands were shaking as she folded clothes. Finally, she simply stopped, letting the dress she was holding fall to the floor. The clock on the mantel struck 9. 2 hours. 120 minutes before her life ended. A knock at the door made her jump. "Come in," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Richard Montgomery entered the room looking as though he had aged 10 years in the last few hours. His gray hair, always so carefully combed, was disheveled. His tie was loosened, and in his eyes was an expression of desperation Elizabeth had never seen there before. "Lizzie," he began, using the childhood nickname he hadn't spoken in years. Don't call me that, she said sharply. You don't have the right to call me that anymore. Her father clenched his jaw. I need to explain something. Explain? Elizabeth felt the anger finally cut through the shock and the fear. What is there to explain, Dad? That you bet me in an illegal card game? That you lost me to a Russian gangster like a poker chip? Please, enlighten me. I'm all ears. It was more complicated than that, Richard said, but his voice was weak. Hello. Then explain it. I have time. 110 minutes to be exact. Richard sank into the armchair by the window, suddenly looking like an old, broken man. 6 months ago the company was in serious trouble. Our new drug, the one we spent $500 million developing, turned out to have fatal side effects. The FDA blocked it. Investors pulled out. We were on the edge of bankruptcy. So I went to Dmitry Volkov for a loan. You went to a gangster, Elizabeth finished, her stomach turning. I had no choice. No legitimate lender would have touched us. Volkov offered $20 million at 20% interest in 6 months. That's $8 million in interest, Elizabeth said immediately. $28 million total. I thought I could manage it. I thought I could sell some assets, find an investor. Richard covered his face with his hands. But no one wanted to touch Montgomery Pharmaceuticals. We were contaminated. And then Volkov started demanding his money. I tried to negotiate, tried to buy more time, but he. So instead, you offered him me. Elizabeth finished, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. How could you? How could you do this to your own child? Tears streamed down Richard's face. He would have killed all of us, Lizzie. Your mother. You. Me. The entire family. I've seen what he does to people who cross him. Bodies that are never found. Families that disappear without a trace. And he said, Richard swallowed hard. He said he would take care of you. That he wouldn't hurt you. That he only wants a wife, someone from a good family, someone who can help him enter legitimate society. And you believed him? Elizabeth laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. You believed a gangster who probably has the blood of hundreds of people on his hands. What else could I do? Richard burst out, rising abruptly. Let him kill all of us. You could have been a man, Elizabeth said quietly, looking at her father with cold, new eyes. You could have accepted the consequences of your own actions. You could have died with honor instead of selling your own daughter to save your pathetic skin. The silence that fell between them was thick and poisonous. Richard opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. Finally he turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door softly behind him. Elizabeth was left alone with her thoughts and the ticking of the clock, which now sounded like a countdown toward an execution. 11 o'clock arrived both too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Elizabeth heard the sound of cars pulling up in front of the house, the low purr of expensive engines echoing off the empty street. She moved to the window and looked through the curtains. 3 black SUVs were lined up in front of the Montgomery residence. Men in black suits stepped out. Their figures looked sinister under the glow of the street lamps. They moved with military precision, unhurried, but with the absolute confidence of people who know that no one will dare interfere with them. The doorbell rang. Elizabeth heard Mrs. Chun, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for 15 years, go to answer it. The voices below were muffled, but Elizabeth could make out the low, authoritative tone of one of the men. Elizabeth Montgomery. It's time to go. Her legs almost refused to obey her as she walked down the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself was trying to give her more time in the only home she had ever known. 5 men waited below, all tall, all well-built, all with faces carved from stone. But it was the man standing at the center who held her attention. This was not Dmitry Volkov. She knew it instinctively. This man was too young, perhaps 30, with blonde hair cropped in military style and pale blue eyes that reminded her of ice on a frozen lake. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, giving his face a permanently threatening expression. Miss Montgomery, he said in English, his Russian accent heavy. I am Alexei Petrov, head of security for Mr. Volkov. I have come for you. Please come with me without incident, and everything will go smoothly. Elizabeth looked at her father, who was standing by the staircase, a shadow of the man he once was. Part of her wanted to beg, to scream, to plead with him to do something, anything, to save her. But the larger part, that part of her which had grown up and hardened in the last 3 hours, knew it was pointless. May I bring my suitcase? she asked. Her voice was calmer than she expected. Alexei nodded. One of my men will carry it. No, Elizabeth said firmly. I'll carry it myself. It's the last thing I'll do in this house as a free person. At least give me that. Something moved across Alexei's face, perhaps respect, perhaps surprise. He nodded. Quickly, Elizabeth returned to her room for the last time. She picked up the small travel bag she had packed and looked around, trying to memorize every detail. She knew she would never see this room again. On the desk sat a photograph from her 21st birthday. Her mother, and her father, smiling and happy at a time when life was simple and Elizabeth's greatest concern was choosing a university. She picked up the photograph and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. That was all she was taking from her previous life. When she came back downstairs, Alexei was waiting patiently. Ready? I'll never be ready, she answered honestly. But I don't have a choice, do I? None of us have a choice in this life, Miss Montgomery, Alexei said, and in his voice there was something that might have been compassion. We are all pawns in a larger game. You'll learn that. They stepped out into the cold November night. A light drizzle was still falling, and the city lights reflected in the wet asphalt like blurred stars. Elizabeth climbed into the middle SUV with Alexei to her right and another bodyguard to her left. The car started smoothly, merging into the late-night traffic on Fifth Avenue. Elizabeth turned to look at the Montgomery residence one last time. Her father was standing in the doorway, a small figure surrounded by light, and even from that distance she could see his shoulders shaking with sobs. She felt no pity, only emptiness. They traveled through the city in silence. Elizabeth watched the familiar streets pass outside the window, wondering if she would ever see them again. They passed her favorite coffee shop on the corner of 78th Street, the boutique where she had bought the dress for her first ball, the park where she played as a child. Every place was a memory, a fragment of a life that now belonged to the past. After about 45 minutes they left the city and merged onto the highway heading north. Signs pointed toward the Catskill Mountains. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken. Where are we going? She finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. To Mr. Volkov's estate, Alexei replied. About 2.5 hours from here. An isolated property in the mountains. Private. Secure. A prison, you mean? Elizabeth said bitterly. Alexei shrugged. It depends on your perspective. For you it may be a prison. For Mr. Volkov, it is his sanctuary. For people like me, it is simply a place of work. How long have you worked for him? 12 years, Alexei said, looking out at the dark highway. Since I was 18. Mr. Volkov found me on Brighton Beach, sleeping on the street after my family was deported back to Russia. He gave me work, a roof over my head, a purpose. I owe him everything. Then you trust him? Elizabeth said, searching for any foothold in this terrifying new reality. Alexei turned and looked at her, his pale eyes studying her face. Mr. Volkov is merciless, but fair. If you don't betray him, he won't harm you. He has his own code, his own rules. He's not like common criminals who kill for sport. Everything he does has a reason, a purpose. Then what is his reason for taking me? Elizabeth asked. What does he want from me? That, Alexei said, closing the conversation, you will have to ask him yourself. The rest of the journey passed in silence. Elizabeth watched the city disappear behind them, replaced by the deepening darkness of the countryside. Trees lined both sides of the highway like shadows. The few houses they passed looked small and far away. Eventually, they turned off the main highway onto a narrow paved road that wound upward through the forest. There were no other cars, no lights except their own headlights cutting through the black. This was the edge of the world, Elizabeth thought. A place where no one would hear her, even if she screamed. After another 20 minutes, they reached a tall iron gate fitted with surveillance cameras and an intercom system. Alexei pressed a button on his phone, and the gate swung open smoothly, letting them onto a long gravel-covered driveway. Elizabeth held her breath when Volkov's estate appeared before them. This was no ordinary property. It was a fortress. A massive stone building, styled like a European castle, rose up before them, its windows glowing with warm amber light in the darkness. Towers at both ends of the main structure gave the place a medieval quality, though modern elements, solar panels, satellite dishes, revealed its contemporary interior. The gardens surrounding the house were meticulously maintained even in November, with geometric hedges and stone pathways. But what truly captured Elizabeth's attention was the 3-meter perimeter fence topped with razor wire, surveillance cameras every 10 meters, and floodlights that swept the surrounding grounds at regular intervals. Armed men patrolled the property, their dark silhouettes visible against the illuminated building. "Welcome home," said Alexei, with no trace of irony in his voice. The car stopped before the main entrance, 2 large double doors of dark wood, decorated with metalwork. Alexei stepped out first and opened the door for Elizabeth, extending his hand to help her down. Elizabeth ignored his hand and stepped out alone, determined to preserve whatever dignity she had left. The cold mountain air hit her immediately, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was far colder here than in the city, and her thin coat was completely inadequate. The doors opened before they reached them, and a middle-aged woman in a black housekeeper's uniform appeared on the threshold. She had a severe face and gray hair pulled tightly into a bun, but her eyes were kind when they found Elizabeth. "Good evening, Miss Montgomery," she said in English, with a faint Russian accent. "I am Olga Dmitrievna, housekeeper of this estate. Mr. Volkov is expecting you in his study. Please follow me." Elizabeth crossed the threshold, feeling with every step that she was walking somewhere she could never return from. The interior was breathtaking in its elegance. Marble floors, high ceilings with painted frescoes, crystal chandeliers that scattered rainbows across the walls, dark wooden staircases spiraling up to the upper floors, heavy gilt-framed portraits hanging on every wall. It was beautiful, but the beauty was cold and personal. This was not a home. It was a showpiece palace, designed to impress and to intimidate. Olga led her down a wide corridor, past several closed doors, until she stopped before a set of carved double doors. She knocked 3 times. "Come in," came a voice from within, deep, carrying that same Russian accent Elizabeth had heard through the door of her father's study. Olga opened the doors and gently guided Elizabeth inside, then closed the doors behind her, leaving her alone with Dmitry Volkov. The study was enormous, an entire wall lined with bookshelves, a large mahogany desk at the center, and a fireplace where a fire burned cheerfully. But Elizabeth barely registered any of it, because every ounce of her attention was drawn to the man standing by the window with his back to her. Dmitry Volkov was taller than she had expected, perhaps 6'3", broad-shouldered, with the posture of a man in perfect physical condition. He wore black trousers and a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms marked with scars and what appeared to be Russian prison tattoos. When he turned around, Elizabeth had to stop herself from taking a step backward. Dmitry Volkov was handsome in a way that was both magnetic and terrifying. Dark hair swept back from his face, a sharply defined jaw, a nose that looked as though it had been broken and healed badly. But it was his eyes that captured her and refused to let go, gray, the color of steel on a cold day, so intense she felt as though he could see directly inside her soul. A scar crossed his left eyebrow. Another ran along his right cheek. Knife scars. The scars of a man for whom violence was not an event. It was a way of life. He was 35, she recalled from what she had heard. But he looked both younger and older at the same time. Younger in the strength and grace with which he moved. Older in the hard, cold expression of someone who had seen and done things that would destroy most people's spirits. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, measuring, searching, each one looking for something in the other. Finally, Dmitry spoke. His voice was low and soft, but it carried absolute authority. "Elizabeth Montgomery, welcome to your new home." Elizabeth did not respond immediately. Instead, she forced herself to hold Dmitry Volkov's gaze, refusing to allow herself to show the fear that was consuming her. She had learned in the world of the New York elite that showing weakness was an open invitation to be devoured alive. And if that was true in the world of cocktails and boardrooms, it was certainly true in the world of the man standing before her. "This is not my home," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "A home is a place you choose. This is a prison, no matter how beautiful the bars." Something moved across Dmitry's face. Perhaps amusement. Perhaps respect. One corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile that did not reach his eyes. "You have courage, Elizabeth Montgomery. That's good. You're going to need it." He moved toward her slowly, each step deliberate and controlled, like a predator evaluating its prey. Elizabeth clenched her hands into fists, driving her nails into her palms to stop herself from stepping back. She would not give him the satisfaction of watching her retreat. Dmitri stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell him. Expensive cologne, cigar smoke, and something darker, something more primitive beneath it all. The heat of his body radiated toward her. She could see the small details of his face, the scars that marked his skin like a map of a violent life. "Let me explain something," he said quietly, his voice dangerously smooth. "Your father owed me $8 million. He had 6 months to pay. He missed his deadline. In my world, the consequence of that is swift and brutal death. But instead, he offered me something I considered more valuable. I am not merchandise," Elizabeth said, her voice rising. "In my world, everything is merchandise," Dmitri replied, raising one hand toward her face. Elizabeth went completely still as his fingers brushed lightly against her cheek, a touch so faint she could almost imagine it, yet so intense she felt it to her bones. "Money, power, loyalty, life. And you, Elizabeth, you are mine now. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." "I will never accept that," she hissed, pulling her face away from his touch. "You can lock me in here. You can threaten me. But you will never own me, not where it matters." Dmitri withdrew his hand, but his eyes never left her face. "We'll see," he said simply. Then he turned and walked back to his desk, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Would you like a drink?" "No." "As you wish." He swallowed the whiskey in one motion and set down the glass. "Olga will show you to your room. Everything you need has been prepared. Clothing in your size, cosmetics, books, whatever might interest you. If there is anything you require, tell Olga and it will be provided." "I want a phone," Elizabeth said immediately. "And internet access." Dmitri laughed, a deep sound that rolled through the room like thunder. "No. No contact with the outside world. Not for now. Perhaps later, when I discover I can trust you. You will never be able to trust me. We'll see." Dmitri sat on the edge of his desk, crossing his arms over his chest, studying her with an expression she could not decipher. "I have rules, Elizabeth. Rules that keep me alive and at the top of a very dangerous world. One of those rules is that I never take something I haven't earned, bought, or won in a fair fight. Your father surrendered you to me to pay his debt. That makes you legally mine. But," he added, watching her expression, "I am not an animal. I have no intention of forcing myself on you, if that is what you fear." Elizabeth felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, though she remained deeply suspicious. "Why should I believe you?" "Because if I wanted to hurt you, I would have already done so," Dmitri said. His voice was matter of fact, not threatening, simply a statement of fact. "I don't need your consent to take what I want. But I've found that things given willingly are far more satisfying than things taken by force." "I will never give myself to you willingly," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling despite every effort to hold it steady. Dmitri smiled, and this time the smile reached his eyes, making him look years younger and dangerously attractive. "That's what you think right now, but I've watched the strongest men break under the right kind of pressure. And you, Elizabeth, despite all your courage, are not as strong as you believe." "That sounds like a challenge." "It's a promise," Dmitri replied, rising. He walked to the door and opened it, calling for Olga, who was waiting outside. "Olga, please show Miss Montgomery to her room. Make sure she has everything she needs." He paused, his voice sharpening. "And make sure she understands the boundaries. The 3rd floor is forbidden. The basement is forbidden. If she attempts to escape, security has orders to stop her, using force if necessary. Is that clear?" "Yes, Mr. Volkov," Olga replied with a small bow. Elizabeth wanted to protest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw herself at Dmitri and tear that arrogant certainty from his face. But that part of her, the logical part that had survived 24 years in the ruthless world of high society, knew it would be pointless. She needed to conserve her energy, gather information, wait for the right moment. So instead, she followed Olga out of the room, feeling Dmitri's eyes burning a hole in her back. Olga led her through a labyrinth of hallways and up the grand staircase to the 2nd floor. The mansion was even larger on the inside than it appeared from outside, dozens of rooms, most with closed doors. Elizabeth tried to memorize the route as she walked, counting turns, mentally noting landmarks, windows that might provide an escape route, doors that might lead outside. "This will be your room, Miss Montgomery," Olga said, stopping before a pair of double doors at the end of a long corridor. She opened them and stepped back. The room was stunning. Enormous, with high ceilings and large windows looking out over the dark forest surrounding the property. A grand canopy bed dominated one wall, dressed in deep gray and silver silk. A marble-framed fireplace. A vanity with a gilt-edged mirror. A walk-in wardrobe that appeared larger than her old bedroom in New York. "The bathroom is there," Olga said, gesturing to a door on the left. "You have a whirlpool tub and a shower. Towels and robes are in the cabinet. You'll find clothing in the wardrobe, all in your size." Mr. Volkov also had jewelry and accessories prepared. Elizabeth walked slowly inside, feeling as though she had stepped into another world. Everything was luxurious, expensive, perfect, and yet despite all its beauty, she felt as though she had walked into a beautiful cage. "Breakfast is served at 8 in the small dining room on the first floor," Olga continued. "Lunch at 1, dinner at 8 in the evening. If you prefer to eat in your room, I can bring meals to you." Mr. Volkov typically dines alone in his study, unless he specifically requests your presence. "So I'm a prisoner with luxury accommodations," Elizabeth said bitterly. Olga looked at her, and for the first time Elizabeth saw something in those eyes that resembled genuine compassion. "You are not the first young woman to find herself in this situation, Miss Montgomery, and you probably won't be the last. I can only offer you one piece of advice. Don't fight what you cannot change. Mr. Volkov is not a cruel man, but he is merciless. If you cooperate with him, your life here can be quite tolerable. If you fight," Olga shook her head, "fighting will only make things harder for you. So I should simply surrender? Simply accept that I was sold like a slave." "You should survive," Olga said quietly. "And sometimes surviving requires compromises we never thought we would have to make." With that, Olga moved toward the door. "If you need anything, press the button beside the bed. I'll come as soon as I can. Good night, Miss Montgomery." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Elizabeth was alone. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to collapse. She sat on the edge of the bed, covered her face with her hands, and let the tears finally come. She cried in silence, her body shaking with everything she had held back. All the fear, the rage, the despair, finally breaking through the surface. How had this happened? How could her life, which yesterday had seemed so stable, so predictable, have fallen apart so completely? She thought of her mother in Switzerland, almost certainly unaware of what had happened. She thought of her friends, who were probably already wondering where she had disappeared. She thought of the future she had planned: university, a career, a husband she would choose herself, children who would come at the right time. All of that was past now. Now she belonged to Dmitry Volkov, a man who was at once the most beautiful and the most terrifying she had ever encountered. Eventually the tears dried, leaving her exhausted and hollow. She got up and went to the bathroom, needing to wash her face, to recover some kind of control over herself. The bathroom was as lavish as the rest of the room, all marble and gold. The tub was large enough for 3 people. The shower had so many heads it could drench you from every angle. Elizabeth washed her face with cold water and looked at her reflection. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale, a ghost of herself. But as she stood there looking into the mirror, something inside her began to shift. The anger she had felt before began to crystallize into something harder, something stronger. No, she would not let Dmitry Volkov break her. She would not let him turn her into a terrified victim who simply accepted her fate. If she was going to be a prisoner, she would be a prisoner who never stopped searching for a way out. If she was going to be his property, she would be a property that never forgot it was a human being with its own free will. She returned to the room with new determination and began exploring the space more systematically. The wardrobe was filled with rows of clothing, expensive brands, all in her size. Dresses, skirts, blouses, jeans, all carefully organized by color and style. Shoes on the shelves, hundreds of pairs, from elegant heels to comfortable sneakers. She found jewelry on the vanity, diamonds, emeralds, rubies, everything genuine, everything worth a fortune. Cosmetics, every brand she had ever used, every product she had ever mentioned liking. Dmitry Volkov clearly did not do things halfway, and someone had studied her, known her size, her style, her preferences. It was impressive and deeply unsettling all at once. Elizabeth moved to the window and stared out into the darkness. The floodlights swept across the grounds, and she could see the silhouettes of guards patrolling below. She tried to open the window, but it was locked. No way to open it from the inside. So this is my prison, she thought. A gilded cage with silk sheets and diamond jewelry, but a cage all the same. She was too exhausted to continue exploring. The day had been the longest and most traumatic of her life, and the weight of it all suddenly crashed down on her like a wave. She found a nightgown in one of the drawers, changed out of her rain-damp clothes, and slipped beneath the cool sheets of the enormous bed. She lay in the darkness, watching shadows dance across the ceiling from the fire someone had lit in the fireplace. She could hear the distant sounds of the house settling around her, sporadic voices from the guards outside, the soft whisper of wind in the trees. And somewhere in this great house was Dmitry Volkov, the man who now controlled every aspect of her existence. Elizabeth closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep did not come easily. Her mind turned with questions, plans, and fears. Finally, when the clock somewhere in the house struck 3 in the morning, she sank into a restless sleep filled with steel-gray eyes and dangerous promises. She woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. For one brief moment, she could not remember where she was. This was not her bed in New York. Then everything came flooding back like cold water, and she felt her stomach contract. This was not a nightmare. This was her new reality. Sunlight poured through the windows, bright, almost cheerful, completely at odds with everything she was feeling. She checked the clock on the nightstand. 9:30. She had slept late, probably from the sheer exhaustion of the day before. There was a knock at the door, and then Olga entered carrying a tray. "Good morning, Miss Montgomery. You missed breakfast, so I thought I would bring something to you." "I'm not hungry," Elizabeth said, though her stomach immediately contradicted her with a low growl. Olga ignored this and set the tray on the small table by the window. "You must eat, miss. You haven't eaten since yesterday. Mr. Volkov will not be pleased if I allow you to starve." "And what does Mr. Volkov care?" Elizabeth asked bitterly. "Mr. Volkov has asked that you join him for lunch in his study. At 1 o'clock. He asked me to tell you. It is not an invitation. It is an order." Of course it was an order. Everything in this place was an order. Elizabeth climbed out of bed and approached the tray. Fresh coffee, toast, eggs, fruit, juice. Her stomach growled again. She sat down and ate. The food was perfect, prepared by a professional chef, without question. Despite everything, she found herself eating every bite. "Is there anything you need, Miss Montgomery?" Olga asked, standing discreetly near the door. Elizabeth considered the question. There were a million things she needed. Her freedom, her family, her old life. But none of those things were within Olga's power to give. "I need to know what he wants from me," she said finally. "Dmitry, why did he bring me here? What does he plan to do with me?" Olga hesitated, her face struggling with some internal decision. "It is not my place to say, Miss Montgomery. But I can tell you this. Mr. Volkov is not like other men. He has his reasons for everything he does. Sometimes those reasons make sense much later. Sometimes they never make sense at all, but he always has reasons." It was not the answer Elizabeth wanted, but she knew it was all she was going to get from Olga. After breakfast, she took a long shower, letting the hot water work some of the tension from her muscles. Then she spent time choosing what to wear, which she knew was ridiculous, given everything at stake, but it gave her something to control, a small decision that was entirely hers. She chose simple black trousers and a white silk blouse. Something elegant, but not too formal. She wanted to look composed, dignified, not as if she were trying to impress Dmitry. At 1 o'clock, Olga returned to escort her to Dmitry's study. Elizabeth followed her down the stairs, her heart beating faster with every step. She didn't know what to expect from this meeting, and the uncertainty was almost worse than the fear itself. Olga knocked on the study door. Dmitry's voice called from within. "Come in." Elizabeth took a deep breath and entered. Dmitry was seated behind his desk, reviewing documents. He looked different in the daylight, younger somehow, though no less dangerous. He wore a dark suit that probably cost more than her old car, and his hair was damp, as if he had just showered. He looked up when she entered. His gray eyes swept over her in a way that made her feel simultaneously exposed and studied. Elizabeth. Punctual. That's good. Sit. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Elizabeth sat, keeping her spine straight, her hands carefully folded in her lap. She would not let him see how nervous she was. How did you sleep? Dmitri asked, leaning back in his chair and looking at her with an expression she could not read. As well as can be expected, she answered carefully. Given the circumstances. Circumstances, Dmitri repeated, smiling slightly. A very diplomatic way to describe being kidnapped and held against your will. That's exactly what it is, Elizabeth said, her voice finding its strength. You can dress it in pretty language, you can talk about debts and contracts, but the truth is I'm here against my will. That makes you a kidnapper, and it makes me a victim. But I don't think you like thinking of yourself that way. Do you, Elizabeth? Dmitri said. I don't think you want to be a victim. Of course I don't want to be a victim. I want to go home. I want my life back. Unfortunately, Dmitri said simply, that is not possible. Your previous life ended the moment your father signed his agreement with me. You have a new life now. Here. With me. As what? Elizabeth demanded. Your prisoner? Your servant? Your. She couldn't bring herself to say the word. The fear that had haunted her through the night. As my wife. Dmitri completed, and Elizabeth's world stopped for a long moment. She could only stare at him, her mind refusing to process what she had just heard. What? She whispered. I want you to become my wife, Dmitri repeated, his voice calm, as though he were discussing a business contract and not her entire future. That is why I brought you here. That is why I accepted you in place of your father's money. I need a wife, Elizabeth. Someone from a good family, with a respected name. Someone who can help me enter the world that has always been closed to me. Elizabeth felt the room tilt around her. This was worse than anything she had imagined. Are you out of your mind? She said, her voice shaking. You think you can simply tell me to marry you, and I'll agree? You think you can force someone into marriage? I can, Dmitri said simply. And I will. But I would prefer you come to this willingly. That will never be willing. Give it time, Dmitri said, rising and moving around the desk. Elizabeth instinctively pressed back in her chair as he approached. I know you hate me right now. I know I am a monster in your eyes. But you will come to know me, Elizabeth. You will see that I am not only the beast you believe me to be. And perhaps, in time, you will learn to see me differently. He stopped directly in front of her, again invading her personal space in a way that made her breathing quicken. He placed one finger beneath her chin, gently lifting her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. And perhaps, he continued, his voice dropping low, soft as a warning, when I finally make you mine in every way, it will not be because I forced you. It will be because you asked me to. Not because you had no choice. Because you couldn't resist. Elizabeth felt something dark and dangerous flicker inside her, something she did not want to name. She pushed him back, forcing the anger to the surface. That will never happen. We'll see, Dmitri said, with that same confident smile that made her want to strike him. He released her chin and returned behind his desk. As if summoned by an invisible signal, the door opened and a server entered with a food cart. The aroma was extraordinary. Spiced meat. Fresh bread. Despite everything, Elizabeth's stomach growled. The next hour was surreal. They ate together, Dmitri asking her questions about her life, her interests, her dreams, as though they were on a first date and not in a captor and captive situation. Elizabeth answered carefully, not wanting to share too much, but at the same time finding herself genuinely curious about this strange man who held her life in his hands. She learned that he had grown up in an orphanage in Moscow, fighting for every meal, every warm blanket, every moment of safety. That he had come to America at 16 with nothing but the clothes on his back and an iron will to make something of himself. That he had built his empire transaction by transaction, never backing down, never showing weakness. And despite herself, despite everything, Elizabeth felt an unexpected flicker of something like respect for this man. Not justification, not acceptance, but respect for the sheer force of what it must have taken to survive and thrive in a world that had probably tried to kill him hundreds of times. But respect was not trust, and it was certainly not love. When the lunch ended, Dmitri walked her to the door. You have free access to most of the house, he said. The library on the first floor, the sitting room, the gardens, as long as you remain within the fence line. Only the third floor and the basement are forbidden. And of course, he added with that dangerous smile, do not attempt to escape. My men have orders to stop you, and I would prefer not to have to punish you for disobedience. And what would those punishments be? Elizabeth asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Dmitri leaned closer, his breath warm near her ear. Nothing that would permanently harm you, he murmured. But I would find ways to break you slowly, methodically, until nothing remained of that little spark of resistance I see in your eyes. So be smart, Elizabeth. Don't make me show you how truly merciless I can be. With that, he straightened, his face returning to its calm, controlled mask. Good afternoon, Elizabeth. I'll see you at dinner. And she was left standing alone in the hallway, her body trembling from a combination of fear, rage, and something else, something dark and unsettling that she refused to examine too closely. 3 months. 3 months Elizabeth lived in Dmitri Volkov's golden cage, and every day was a chess game whose rules she was still learning. Every conversation was a match of strategies. Every gesture carried hidden meaning. Every look held a promise or a threat, sometimes both at once. Elizabeth learned the rhythm of the house. She woke at 7, often already hearing the sounds of Dmitri training in the private gym on the first floor, the heavy bag being struck with brutal force, labored breathing, occasional Russian curses as he pushed himself past his limits. Sometimes she would step into the hallway and look through the half-open door, watching with a fascination she didn't entirely understand. The brutal grace of his movements, the way his powerful body moved with a precision born of years of training. He always knew she was there. Always. His eyes would find her in the shadow of the hallway, and that small, threatening smile would appear on his lips before he turned back, hitting harder now, as if he wanted to show her exactly what those hands could do. She had breakfast with Olga in the small dining room, then long hours in the library, the only place where Elizabeth felt relatively safe. Thousands of books on the shelves, Russian classics, contemporary thrillers, philosophy, poetry. She read voraciously, hungry to escape into worlds where she was not a prisoner, where her life still belonged to her. But even there Dmitri found ways to appear. He would enter quietly, often without announcing himself, and simply sit in one of the leather armchairs and watch her read. Elizabeth could feel his gaze on her, heavy, intense, studying her every movement as if she were a riddle he was trying to solve. "What are you reading?" he asked one afternoon, his voice low in the silence of the library. Elizabeth didn't look up from the book. Anna Karenina. Tolstoy. There was something in his voice that sounded like amusement. The story of a woman who abandons her life for a forbidden love and ends up beneath the wheels of a train. An interesting choice. It's just a book, Elizabeth said defensively. Nothing is just anything, Dmitri replied, rising and moving toward her armchair. He stood behind her. She could feel the heat of his body, the scent of his cologne mixing with something more primitive, more masculine. Everything we choose, everything we surround ourselves with, says something about us. So what does this choice say about you, Elizabeth? Elizabeth snapped the book shut and turned to face him. Perhaps it says I understand how dangerous it is to let yourself feel things in the wrong situation. Perhaps it's a reminder to keep my heart under control. Dmitri smiled, and the smile was predatory, knowing. Too late for that, I think. Your heart is no longer under your control, and I believe you know it. It belonged to me from the moment you arrived here. You simply refused to admit it. You confuse possession with ownership, Elizabeth said, forcing herself to hold his gaze. You can control my movements, where I go, what I do. But you will never possess my heart. You will never possess me. Not yet, Dmitri agreed. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. A gesture so simple, so intimate, that Elizabeth felt her breath catch. But I have time. And patience. I have a whole life to dismantle every wall you've built around yourself. It was a promise and a threat in one. And Elizabeth didn't know which feeling was stronger, the fear or something else. Something dangerous that had begun to stir inside her despite every effort to stop it. Lunches with Dmitri became a daily routine. Sometimes they ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Other times they talked for hours about everything and nothing, politics, art, music, philosophy. Elizabeth discovered that despite his brutal life, Dmitri was surprisingly cultured, intelligent in a way that went far beyond street cunning. I learned everything I could, he told her one afternoon when she asked about his education. In the orphanage there were few books, but the ones that were there I read until they fell apart. When I came to America, I spent every free moment in public libraries. Knowledge is power, Elizabeth, and I needed every advantage I could get. So you built a criminal empire, Elizabeth said, unable to suppress the sarcasm. I built what was possible, Dmitri replied, his face hardening. Do you think the legal world would have accepted me? A Russian orphan, no family name, no money, no connections. I tried, Elizabeth. I tried to get a normal job, to build a normal life. But doors closed one after another. So I found doors that were open, the ones in the dark. For the first time, Elizabeth saw something in his eyes that looked like regret. Something like pain, buried beneath that hard surface. It disturbed her, because it was easier to hate a monster than to understand a human being. The evenings were the hardest. Dinner at 8. A formal affair in the grand dining room, with Dmitri at one end of the long table and Elizabeth at the other, far enough apart that conversation required raising their voices. She knew this was intentional, his way of maintaining distance, reminding her of her position. But after dinner, when she returned to her room, she would hear his footsteps in the hallway. He would stop in front of her door, sometimes for long minutes, and she knew he was there, on the other side of the wood, wrestling with something. Elizabeth's heart would pound in those moments, not knowing whether she feared him entering or feared that he wouldn't. He never came in. He always walked away eventually, his heavy footsteps fading into the darkness. And Elizabeth was left alone with her contradictory feelings. The only time she felt unobserved was during her walks in the garden. The grounds were vast, carefully maintained, with a maze of hedges, fountains, and stone benches hidden in secluded corners. Elizabeth spent hours there every afternoon, breathing the clean mountain air, trying to clear her mind. But even there she was not truly alone. The guards were always visible, discreet, but always present. And sometimes she would see Dmitri watching her from the window of his third-floor study, his dark silhouette motionless against the light, his eyes following her every move. It was in the 5th week that everything shifted. Elizabeth was exploring a far corner of the garden she had never visited before when she heard voices, harsh, angry Russian. Curiosity overcame caution. She followed the sound, hiding herself behind a tall hedgerow. There, in a small courtyard hidden from the main house, was a scene that turned her blood to ice. Dmitri stood in the middle of 5 men, all in dark suits, all bearing signs of having been beaten. One man was on his knees before Dmitri, his face a mass of bruises, blood dripping from a split brow. Dmitri spoke quietly, too quietly for Elizabeth to hear the words, but the tone was glacial, merciless. The man on the ground trembled, responding in a broken, pleading voice. Then Dmitri reached inside his jacket and drew a weapon, a black pistol that looked lethally efficient in his hand, like an extension of his body. Elizabeth wanted to run. She wanted to close her eyes. She wanted to be anywhere else on earth. But she was paralyzed, unable to look away. Dmitri placed the barrel of the pistol against the kneeling man's temple. He said something, final, absolute. The man closed his eyes. His face was a mask of pure desperation. And then Dmitri pulled the trigger. The shot shattered the silence of the afternoon like a thunderclap. The man collapsed to the ground, motionless, a spreading pool of dark red on the pale stones of the courtyard. Elizabeth felt the bile surge up her throat. She pressed her hand over her mouth, desperately trying to hold back the sound that threatened to escape. But something must have broken through, because suddenly Dmitri's eyes found her, hidden behind the hedgerow. Their gazes locked across the distance. In his eyes, no guilt, no shame. Only the cold, hard certainty of a man who had just done what he considered necessary. Elizabeth, he said quietly. Her name sounded like a warning and a summons at the same time. Come here. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs did not obey. She stepped out from her hiding place slowly, feeling the world spin around her, feeling the reality of this place, of this man, finally reaching her completely. Dmitri waited without moving, watching her approach. The other men stepped back, creating space between them. The body still lay on the ground, eyes open and empty, staring at a sky it would never see again. Who was he? Elizabeth asked. Her voice was distant, thin, as if it belonged to someone else. A traitor, Dmitri said simply. A man who was selling information to my enemies. A man who threatened the safety of everyone in this organization, including you. So you killed him, Elizabeth said. It was not a question. Yes. Just like that. No apology, no hesitation. Without a trial. Without a chance to defend himself. Dmitri tucked the weapon back inside his jacket. In my world there are no trials, Elizabeth. There are only consequences. This man knew the rules when he joined my organization. He knew what would happen if he betrayed me. He made his choice. I carried out the sentence. Elizabeth looked at the body, her stomach clenching. How can you be so calm? You just took a man's life. He was not the first, Dmitri said, moving toward her. And he will not be the last. This is what I am, Elizabeth. This is the world I live in. Did you think all of this, he gestured around him, was built on something other than violence? I knew it, Elizabeth whispered. But knowing and seeing are two very different things. Dmitri reached out and gently took her chin in his hand, turning her face toward him and away from the body. Now you've seen it. Now you know exactly who you are dealing with. The question is, does this change anything between us? Elizabeth pulled away from his hold. It changes everything. Does it? Dmitri asked quietly. I never thought you would love a saint, Elizabeth. I knew from the beginning that if you ever felt anything for me, it would be with full awareness of who I am. A monster, a killer, a man with the blood of hundreds on his hands. I never pretended otherwise. This is madness, Elizabeth said, feeling tears burning her eyes. All of this is madness. Perhaps, Dmitri agreed, but it is my madness. And now it is yours. He turned to his men. Alexei, take care of the body. Standard procedure. The rest of you, back to work. Meeting tomorrow at 6. The men disappeared quickly and efficiently. 2 of them carrying the body, the others dispersing in different directions. Within minutes the courtyard was empty, as though nothing had ever happened there. Only the dark stain on the pale stones remained as evidence of what had taken place. Dmitri extended his hand toward Elizabeth. Come, you need to rest. Don't touch me, she said, stepping back from him. I can't, not right now. Something moved across Dmitri's face. Pain, perhaps, or anger. His jaw tightened, but he lowered his hand. As you wish. But Elizabeth, he said as she turned to leave. This changes nothing between us. You are still here. You still belong to me. And whatever you think you saw today, it is only the surface of who I am. Elizabeth fled to her room and leaned against the closed door, finally allowing the tears to fall. She had seen violence in films, read about it in books, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of watching a life erased in a fraction of a second with the cold efficiency of a man who had done it too many times for it to matter anymore. And the worst part, the part that shook her most deeply, in the darkest corner of her heart, was that something in her had been moved by what she saw, not by the violence itself, but by the absolute power Dmitri commanded, the way men twice his size trembled in his presence, the unshakable certainty with which he carried himself. She knew it was wrong. She knew it was twisted. But it was real, and she could not deny it. For the following week she avoided Dmitri as much as possible. She ate in her room instead of joining him for lunch. She stayed in the library only when she knew he was occupied with meetings. She walked in the garden early each morning while he was still training. But she could not avoid him forever. He found her on the 8th day after the execution, sitting beside the fountain in the farthest corner of the garden, watching the water catch the light of the afternoon sun. He sat down beside her without a word, simply sharing the silence for long minutes. I won't apologize for what you saw, he said finally, his voice low but steady. I can't. It was a necessity, something I had to do to protect everything I've built. I know, Elizabeth said, and surprised herself by meaning it. I don't expect an apology. I just needed time to process it. And have you? Elizabeth looked at him, studying his profile in the golden afternoon light. He was striking in a severe way, all sharp angles and shadows, a face forged by violence and survival. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to hate you even more for what I saw. Part of me understands that in your world you had no choice. And part of me. She stopped herself. Part of you what? Dmitri asked, turning to look at her, his gray eyes intense. Part of me is frightened by what I feel, Elizabeth whispered, because I shouldn't feel anything beyond repulsion. But there is something else, something I don't understand, something dark and dangerous. Dmitri reached out and took her hand in his fingers strong and warm. That's normal, Elizabeth. People are drawn to power, to strength, to danger. It is primitive. It's in our DNA. Women have always been drawn to men who are dangerous to others, but safe to them. But you are not safe to me, Elizabeth said. You are the most dangerous man in my life. I will never physically harm you, Dmitri said, his thumb tracing the inside of her wrist in a way that sent a tremor up her spine. I promise you that. But emotionally, psychologically, he smiled. That dark, predatory smile that always made her heart beat faster. I'm afraid I have already begun to take you apart. And by the time I am finished, you won't know where I end and where you begin. That should have terrified her more than anything else. And it did. But there was something electric in that promise, in the idea of being so deeply connected to another person that the boundaries between them dissolved entirely. Why me? She asked suddenly. The question that had been haunting her for months. You could have had hundreds of women who would have come to you willingly. Women without baggage. Women who already understand your world. Why did you want me? Dmitri was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the mountains visible on the horizon. Because you are pure, he said finally. Not in a literal sense, but in your soul. You grew up in the light, surrounded by good things, good people. You never had to do the things that break a person. And his voice became rough, almost painful. I have lived in the darkness for so long that I forgot what light looked like. I wanted some of that light for myself. I wanted something untouched in a life full of blood and filth. But you dragged me into the darkness, Elizabeth whispered. Yes, Dmitri agreed. Because I discovered that I cannot live in the light. It was never mine to have. He looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes stole the breath from her lungs. So instead I brought the light into the darkness. And now he paused. You are the only bright thing in my dark world. And I will never let you go. Elizabeth should have pulled her hand away. She should have stood up and walked away. She should have told him that this could never work, that they were too different, that what he called connection was only the result of her captivity, Stockholm Syndrome in its purest form. Instead, she sat there holding his hand, feeling the warmth of his body beside hers. And for the first time in months, she felt something that might have been peace. It was that night when everything changed. Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the conversation by the fountain, the way he had touched her, the way he had looked at her. Her body felt electrified, every nerve on edge, every brush of the sheets against her skin too sharp, too vivid. She got up and went to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden below. It was beautiful, peaceful, deceptively normal. Hard to believe that only days ago she had witnessed a man die on those same grounds. Then she heard footsteps in the hallway. She recognized them now. The heavy, certain stride of Dmitri Volkov. He stopped in front of her door, as he did every night, and Elizabeth waited, holding her breath, expecting him to walk away as he always did. But this time there was a knock. Quiet, but deliberate. Elizabeth's heart stopped. She moved to the door slowly, her hand trembling when she touched the handle. She could ignore it. She could pretend she was asleep. She could tell him to leave. Instead, she opened the door. Dmitri stood in the darkened hallway, wearing only black athletic trousers, his chest bare, his skin marked with the tattoos that told the story of a life lived in shadows. I can't sleep, he said, his voice rough, taut. I think of you. The way you looked by the fountain today. The way you took my hand. The way you looked at me. And I can't bear it any longer, Elizabeth. I cannot keep lying alone knowing you are this close. Elizabeth felt something inside her break, some last line of defense she had been desperately clinging to. What do you want from me, Dmitri? Everything, he said simply. Your mind. Your soul. I want you to be mine in every sense of the word. And if you say no, I will leave, Dmitri continued, and in his voice there was something that might have been pain. I'll go, and I will never knock on this door again. But you have to tell me now, Elizabeth. You have to make a choice, because if you let me in tonight, if you give me any part of yourself, there is no going back. There is no pretending this didn't happen. You will be mine, completely and irrevocably. Elizabeth stood there, torn between everything she believed and everything she wanted. This was a line she could not uncross. Once crossed, everything would change. She would no longer be a prisoner with a clear conscience. She would be complicit in her own captivity, the lover of a man she should despise. But as she stood there, looking into Dimitri's dark, intense eyes, feeling the heat of his presence, feeling something hungry and undeniable rising within her, she knew she had already made her decision. "Come in," she whispered, stepping aside to let him through. Dimitri stepped inside slowly and closed the door behind him. The soft click of the latch was final, irrevocable. He didn't move for a moment, just looked at her in the darkness, lit only by moonlight through the window. "Are you sure?" he asked, giving her one last chance to take it back. "No," she answered honestly. "I'm not sure of anything, but I know I don't want you to leave. Not tonight." That was all the invitation he needed. He closed the space between them in 2 long strides. His hands found her face, and then his lips were on hers. Warm, demanding, absolutely unyielding. Elizabeth made a sound that was half sigh, half surrender, and pulled him closer. What followed was the unraveling of months of tension, months of resistance, months of wanting something she had refused to name. Every wall she had ever built around herself came down in the darkness of that room. He was fierce and he was gentle, demanding and patient in equal measure. He showed her things she had never known about herself, and she discovered she had a power over him that she never expected. The power to make this formidable, terrifying man tremble. When dawn finally came, painting the sky in pale rose and gold, Elizabeth lay in Dimitri's arms, her head resting on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She knew that everything had changed. She was no longer simply a prisoner. She was the lover of a man who lived in darkness. And God forgive her, she did not regret a single moment. The morning sickness began exactly 6 weeks after that night. Elizabeth was kneeling on the cold marble floor of the bathroom, her body racked by another wave of nausea, sweat damp on her forehead. It was the 3rd morning in a row. She could no longer pretend it was the flu or something she had eaten. She knew. Deep down, she already knew exactly what it meant. Olga found her there 10 minutes later, still pale and trembling, leaning against the wall. The older woman looked at her with a single glance full of understanding and compassion. "How long?" Olga asked quietly, closing the bathroom door behind her. 6 weeks, Elizabeth whispered. "Maybe 7. I'm not certain." Olga nodded, her face serious. "Mr. Volkov must know." "Not yet. I only began to suspect a few days ago." "You must tell him," Olga said firmly. "Today? You cannot keep this from him, Miss Montgomery. This is not information you can hide. Mr. Volkov does not like surprises." Elizabeth knew Olga was right, but the fear was paralyzing. How would Dimitri react? Would he be pleased? Angry? Indifferent? Their relationship had become something complex and intense over the last weeks, something that was no longer simply captor and prisoner, but a child. A child would change everything. Forever. "Help me," Elizabeth said, reaching for Olga. "Help me up." Olga helped her to her feet and gently guided her back to the bedroom. "Stay in bed today," she said. "I'll bring you tea and dry toast. It will help with the nausea. And I'll tell Mr. Volkov you need to speak with him privately." Elizabeth spent the next 2 hours lying in bed, her hand resting unconsciously over her stomach, trying to imagine that somewhere inside her, a tiny life was beginning to form. Dimitri's child. Her child. A combination of both of them, binding her to this man, to this world, from which part of her still desperately wanted to escape. But the larger part of her, the part that had grown and changed over these months, knew there would be no escape. Not now. Perhaps not ever. The door opened. Dimitri entered, his face unreadable. He closed the door behind him and approached the bed, his gray eyes studying her with the intensity that always made her feel exposed. "Olga says you're ill," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed, his hand automatically reaching to feel her forehead. "I should call a doctor." "No," Elizabeth said quickly. "I mean yes, but not for the reason you think." Dimitri's brows drew together. "Explain." Elizabeth took a deep breath and looked him directly in the eyes. "I'm pregnant, Dimitri. Approximately 6, maybe 7 weeks. The doctor will need to confirm it, but I'm certain." The silence that followed was so dense it could have been cut with a knife. Dimitri went completely still, his hand still raised toward her face. His eyes widened with something that might have been shock, disbelief, perhaps even fear. "Are you sure?" he asked finally, his voice low, controlled with visible effort. "Yes, all the signs are there. Morning sickness, fatigue, sensitivity. I need a doctor to confirm it officially, but I'm sure." Dmitri stood and turned away, presenting her with his back, his shoulders rigid. Long minutes passed in silence. Elizabeth's stomach tightened with dread. What was he thinking? What would he say? Finally he turned back. The expression on his face was so raw, so unguarded, that Elizabeth instinctively pressed back into the pillows. "A baby," he said. His voice was hoarse, weighted with emotion. "My baby. Our baby." "Yes," Elizabeth whispered. And then, to her absolute astonishment, Dmitri Volkov dropped to his knees beside the bed. His hands gently cradled her face, and in his eyes were tears. Tears, on the face of this hard, brutal, terrifying man. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice breaking, "you have given me something I never thought I would have. A real family. Not people bound by loyalty and fear, but by blood, and by love." "Are you happy?" she asked, barely daring to believe what she was seeing. "Happy is not a sufficient word," Dmitri said, leaning in to kiss her with a tenderness that stood in complete contrast to everything she knew about him. "I am terrified, overwhelmed, undone. But yes, I am happier than I have ever been in my miserable life." Elizabeth felt something release in her chest, tension she hadn't realized she had been holding. "I thought you might be angry." "Angry?" Dmitri looked at her as though the word made no sense. "Why would I be angry at the greatest gift anyone has ever given me?" He placed his hand gently on her stomach, reverently, carefully, as if he could already feel the life growing inside. "No, Elizabeth, I am not angry. I am changed. From this moment forward, everything changes. You and this child are the most important things in my life. I will protect you both with every breath I have." It was a promise and an oath, and Elizabeth believed every word of it. The months that followed were like something out of a dream. Dmitri became almost obsessively protective, hiring the best doctors, ensuring Elizabeth had everything she could possibly need or want. He moved her to a larger suite on the second floor, with a balcony overlooking the mountains where she could sit and read in the afternoon sun. His touch grew even gentler, though no less passionate. He was careful, always watching over her and the child. And afterward, he would lie with his hand resting on her growing belly, speaking softly to their unborn son or daughter, making promises that Elizabeth was not always sure he could keep, but loved him for making. There was happiness in this, surprising, unexpected happiness. Elizabeth discovered that despite everything, despite the circumstances that had brought her here, despite the darkness of Dmitri's world, she was content. Not in the way she had once imagined her life, not in the bright and innocent happiness of fairy tales, but in a darker, more complex happiness, the kind that belongs to two damaged souls who have found each other in the dark. It was in her 6th month of pregnancy that everything fell apart. Elizabeth was walking in the garden as she did every afternoon, enjoying a rare warm early spring day. Her belly was now visibly full and round, and she could feel the strong kicks of her child against her ribs. A boy, she had learned 2 weeks ago. Dmitri had been overjoyed, already planning his son's future, the empire he would one day inherit. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice the black van that had appeared on the road near the fence line, until it was too late. The gunshots came fast and loud, and Dmitri's guards fell one by one. Elizabeth froze, terror paralyzing her, as masked men cut through the fence and stormed the property. "Run!" shouted one of the guards still standing, pushing her toward the house, but it was already too late. Strong arms seized her from behind. A hand clamped over her mouth, silencing her scream. "We have her," said a voice into a phone. A woman's voice, Russian accent, cold and triumphant. "Tell Volkov that if he wants his woman and his bastard back, he has 24 hours to present himself at the old cement yard at the docks. Alone, unarmed, or she and the child die." Elizabeth fought with everything she had, but a cloth soaked with something sharp and chemical was pressed against her face, and the world blurred into darkness. She woke somewhere cold and damp. The smell of old concrete, rust, and mildew filled her lungs. Her wrists were bound in front of her, her ankles tied to a chair. Her head pounded with a deep, throbbing pain. When she opened her eyes, she was in a large, abandoned space, an old factory or warehouse. Before her stood a tall woman in her 40s, platinum blonde hair pinned in an elegant chignon, eyes the color of ice. She wore an expensive suit and heels, but held a pistol with the practiced ease of someone who had used one many times before. "So you're awake," the woman said in English, her Russian accent heavy. "Good. I want you conscious for this." "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice rough and dry. "I am Irina Koslov," the woman replied, with a cold smile. "An old acquaintance of Dmitri's. A very old one. We were lovers once, many years ago, before he built his empire and forgot the people who helped him get there." "What do you want?" Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer. "I want everything Dmitri took from me," Irina said, circling slowly around Elizabeth's chair. "His territory, his business, his power, and above all, I want to see him destroyed. But first I want to see him broken. And you, my dear Elizabeth, are the perfect instrument for that." "He won't come," Elizabeth said, trying to sound convincing despite the savage pounding of her heart. "He knows it's a trap." "Of course he does," Irina agreed. "Dmitri is not stupid. But he will come anyway, because he has a weakness now that he never had before. He has you, and that child. And for a man like Dmitri, who has spent his whole life completely alone, family is the greatest weakness of all." The hours crawled by like an eternity. Elizabeth tried to stay calm. She tried to think. She tried to find a way out. But there was none. She was surrounded by Irina's armed men, and she was 6 months pregnant, too weakened and restrained to fight even if her hands and feet had been free. She thought of Dmitri, wondering if he would really be reckless enough to come. Part of her prayed he wouldn't, that he would choose his empire over her and the child. But the larger part, the part that loved him in that complicated, fierce, imperfect way, knew that he would come. Because beneath all the brutality, beneath all the layers of darkness, Dmitri loved her too. And love made people do desperate, dangerous, irrational things. The sun was beginning to set when she heard it. The sound of cars, many of them, pulling up outside the building. Sharp commands shouted in Russian. And then gunfire, 10 shots, 20, 30, echoing through the empty space like a barrage of thunder. Irina cursed and grabbed Elizabeth by the hair, yanking her head back with a sharp, searing pain. "Your foolish lover came with an army," she hissed. "He thought he could outmaneuver me." "You told him to come alone," Elizabeth said through clenched teeth. "I did," Irina admitted. "But Dmitri Volkov has never followed anyone's rules. It's part of what makes him so dangerous, and also so predictable." The doors exploded off their hinges. Dmitri entered like a force of nature, pistol raised, his face a mask of pure, controlled fury. Alexei and dozens of his men poured in behind him, all armed, all ready. But Irina was faster. She pressed her weapon against Elizabeth's temple, her finger on the trigger. "One more step, Dmitri," she warned, "or your little American and her baby die here and now." Dmitri froze. His eyes found Elizabeth's across the space. In them she saw everything at once: rage, fear, desperation, love, raw and unfiltered and completely exposed for the first time. "Let her go," he said, his voice low and lethal. "This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this," Irina replied. "She's the reason you've gone soft, the reason you've gotten weak. Do you remember who you used to be, Dmitri? Unstoppable, merciless. But now," she laughed bitterly, "now you are just a man in love. And love makes people do very stupid things." "Tell me what you want," Dmitri said. "Money, territory. We can negotiate." "I want you dead," Irina said simply. "But since that is not an option right now, I'll take the second best thing. You're suffering." Elizabeth saw it happening in slow motion. Irina's finger tightening on the trigger. Dmitri lunging forward, too far to reach in time, his own cry tearing from his throat. And then an explosion of sound, sharp, absolute. But it was not Elizabeth who fell. It was Irina. A clean shot through the forehead. Her eyes wide with surprise as she crumpled to the ground, dead before she touched the concrete floor. Behind her stood Alexei, his pistol still raised, expression completely blank. "No one touches the Volkov family," he said quietly. "No one." What followed was chaos. Irina's men fought back, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Within minutes it was over. Every one of them was dead or fleeing. And then Dmitri was beside Elizabeth, cutting her restraints, his hands shaking as he ran them over her, searching for injuries. Are you hurt? The baby, tell me you're all right. He was speaking rapidly, desperately. I'm fine, she told him, though her whole body was in shock, her mind barely able to process what had just happened. Just get me out of here, please. Dmitri lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her out of the building, through the wreckage, through the blood, to the waiting car. He held her the entire way home, his face buried in her hair, his body shaking with something that might have been tears. I'm sorry, he whispered over and over. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. And Elizabeth held him back, knowing that something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer the woman who believed in clear moral lines, in simple definitions of good and evil. She had lived at the center of violence and emerged from it. And the strangest part was this. She felt safer in the arms of a killer than she had ever felt in her old, ordinary life. The following weeks were a blur. Doctors checking her and the baby again and again, confirming that neither had suffered lasting harm. Dmitri, who refused to leave her side, sleeping in a chair beside her bed, waking at her slightest movement. And slowly, Elizabeth changed. The fear she had felt during the kidnapping transformed into something harder, stronger, a cold and absolute decision that she would never again allow herself to be a victim, never again allow herself to be weak. Teach me, she said to Dmitri one night as they lay together, her belly now enormous, the baby kicking in strong, steady rhythms. Teach me to shoot. Teach me to fight. Teach me to survive in your world. Dmitri looked at her for a long moment. Are you certain? Once you go down that path, there is no coming back. You cannot pretend innocence anymore. I am no longer innocent, Elizabeth said firmly. That innocence died the night you took me, or perhaps the night I let you into my room, or perhaps when I discovered I was carrying your child. I don't know exactly when it ended, but I know where it leads. I will be your queen, Dmitri, not just your wife, not just the mother of your children, your true queen. And queens are not weak. The smile that spread across Dmitri's face was fierce and full of pride at the same time. Then so it shall be. Training begins tomorrow. Their son, Alexander Richard Volkov, was born on a bright May morning, healthy and strong, with lungs powerful enough to wake the entire estate. Dmitri wept when he held him for the first time. This hard, brutal man, reduced to tears by the small, wrinkled face of his newborn son. He will be better than me, Dmitri promised, pressing a kiss to the top of his son's head. He will have everything I never had. A family, love, choice. But choice was an illusion, and both of them knew it. Alexander had been born into this world, into this life, just as his father had been before him. And Elizabeth, looking at her son, felt a mixture of love, pride, and something that might have been sorrow. Sorrow for what? For the life she would never have. For the innocence he would lose too young? The years that followed moved in a blur of days and nights, routine and chaos, love and violence. Elizabeth learned to shoot, and she was good at it. Her hand steady, her aim precise. She learned to read threats, to read people, to navigate the intricate politics of the criminal world. She learned to run the business. Dmitri gave her control of the money laundering operations, using Montgomery Pharmaceuticals as a front. The company her father had nearly destroyed now flourished under her management, though the money flowing through it came from sources no board of directors would ever approve. Richard Montgomery died a year after Alexander's birth, his heart finally giving out beneath the weight of guilt and fear. Elizabeth attended the funeral with Dmitri beside her, dressed in a black Armani suit and Louboutin heels, looking like any other wealthy widow in mourning. But she felt no grief. She looked at her father's coffin and felt only the emptiness where love had once been. He had sold her to save himself, and she had never forgiven him that final act of cowardice. 2 years later, she gave birth to a daughter, Anastasia Elizabeth Volkov, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Dmitri adored her instantly and completely. This fearsome king of the underworld wrapped around the tiny finger of his daughter with a single smile. And Elizabeth ruled beside him, a fist of iron in a velvet glove. The people in Dimitri's organization learned to fear her almost as much as they feared him. Because while Dimitri was brutal and direct, Elizabeth was subtle, strategic, and dangerous in ways they never saw coming. She was the queen of an empire built on blood and money, and she wore her crown with grace and absolute conviction. 5 years after the night that began everything, a young couple was brought to the estate as payment for a debt. The girl was perhaps 22, her eyes wide with terror, her body trembling as she was led into Dimitri's study. Elizabeth sat beside her husband, dressed in a beige Chanel suit, her hair pinned in an elegant chignon, diamonds at her throat and wrists. She looked like any other wealthy executive, if not for the cold, hard clarity in her eyes. "Please," the girl begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't hurt us. My father made a mistake, but we have nothing to do with this." Dimitri looked at Elizabeth. A silent question. Her decision. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Stay," Dimitri told the couple. "Work for me. Be loyal, and you will not be harmed. Betray me, and you will regret the day you were born." When the couple was escorted out, the girl shot one last look back at Elizabeth. In her eyes was a mixture of terror, hope, and something that looked like a desperate, unspoken question. Elizabeth rose and followed them into the hallway, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She stopped in front of the girl and spoke quietly, low enough that only she could hear. "In our world, love and hate are two sides of the same coin," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "First, survive. Then decide whether you will embrace the darkness or let it consume you. But know this, once you enter it, the light will never look the same again." The girl nodded, eyes wide. And Elizabeth saw in those eyes her own reflection from 5 years ago, terrified, desperate, but already beginning to change. That night, Elizabeth stood at the window of their bedroom, watching the mountains glow under the moon. She felt the warmth of Dimitri's body close behind her as he wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her in. "Do you have regrets?" he asked quietly, his breath warm against her neck. Elizabeth thought about it honestly. She thought about the young woman she had been, the life she had planned, the person she had imagined becoming. And then she thought about the woman she had become, the power she held, the family she had built in the darkest of places. "No," she answered, turning in his arms to look into those gray eyes that had always seen every part of her, the light and the shadow both. "No regrets. Because in the darkness I found something I never had in my life. Purpose, power, myself, and me," Dimitri added, his lips curving into that dangerous smile that still made her heart beat faster after all these years. "And you," Elizabeth agreed. "My monster, my king, the father of my children, my queen," Dimitri whispered, leaning down to kiss her. And the kiss was deep and full of promises yet to come, because their children were already asleep in the rooms above, innocent and peaceful, unaware of the world they had been born into, still untouched, in ways their parents no longer were and never would be again. Because some loves bloom in the light, but others, the most intense, the most transformative, are born in the darkness. And Elizabeth Volkov, once Elizabeth Montgomery, had not only learned to survive in the dark, she had learned to rule it. This was not a fairy tale. There was no happy ending in the traditional sense. But there was love, complicated, absolute, and consuming. And sometimes, that is all we ever truly need. In the darkness, they found each other. And in each other, they found everything.